thank you all for joining us. My name is André Natta. I'm going to hold my intro to the end of this great panel that I get to moderate. And I'm still not really sure how I scored that gig. But I'm going to ask our esteemed panel to introduce themselves. And I'm going to go in order of Matt, then Jared, then Michael. And then I'll introduce myself, and then we'll get started. So Matt, if you could lead us off and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Andre. Hey, folks, I'm Matt Kiefer. I'm the data editor at WBEZ, Chicago Public Media, also serving my time as the vice president of Foia for the Headline Club. So I've been involved in planning this thing for the last several months, and it's good to see you all here. Looking forward to talking about Foia.
And I am Jared Rutecki. I am an investigative reporter and data coordinator for the Better Government Association. We're a nearly 100-year-old news nonprofit in the Chicago area. I do a lot of reporting on public safety, public finance, sort of that intersection. And I pretty well send piles and piles of FOIA requests every year for piles and piles of data. So that's essentially my my backstory, as it were. Looks like Michael has popped up.
Because Michael's having some technical difficulties, so I guess I will introduce myself first and then Michael. I'm André Natta. I'm the collaborations editor for Muckrock. We are a platform that helps to make, among other things, filing for public records easier. And one of the other platforms that we have, Document Cloud, helps manage a lot of data for very large-scale projects. This is where I would normally throw it to Michael, but I'm going to let him introduce himself when he gets back into the room.
Probably had one too many tabs open.
Pardon?
Probably had one too many tabs open or closed.
Yeah. He is also joining us from, I believe he's joining us from Metro DC this morning too. I know he's still online, but I would like to. And Mike, I can go ahead and do the introduction. He'll introduce himself again, but he is the co-founder and CEO for Muckrock, which is a pretty big job. I'm always nervous about moderating my boss on a panel, no matter where I am. And here he is now.
I'm so sorry for the connectivity issues today.
It's all good. We are actually right up for your introduction.
Hi, I'm Michael Morisy. I'm one of the co-founders of Muckrock and colleagues with Andre. And, really interested in kind of the topic of sort of how do you get more data via FOIA requests and kind of some of the ins and outs. And we started in 2010, and we've now filed 100,000 requests. And so any way that public records can go wrong, we've seen go wrong, and looking forward to talking about how to make it go right and avoid some of those more problems that we'll be talking about today.
So I kind of want to jump in terms of, because I asked some folks to go feed me some things like to talk about, which seems to make a lot of sense. When you do larger projects, they do lead to problems, but do they have to lead to problems? Jared, do you have any, I guess in part because of what you do, you might have some things to say about issues related to people being scared about taking on projects of a certain size?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that, like, you get into these and you're like, how deep am I getting myself into something else? And like, you do always want to be a little bit realistic on what you can accomplish as one person or what you can do as a team. But I think it's really important for people not to be like, and you'll get this a lot probably when you're making requests too. People are like, do you really want all that? Like, man, that's going to be, that's going to take you a lot of time to get that. And I hope that, like, people don't get so kind of afraid of that end of things. And like, if somebody gets something, you end up getting a response on something and it's like, oh my God, I have no idea how I'm going to comb through this and figure all this stuff out. It does kind of open yourself up to these sorts of partnership opportunities, which in a lot of instances, like working with a bigger team or saying finding somebody else who knows something about this, like, hey, do you want to team up on this sort of thing, is both an opportunity for you to learn and kind of increase the kind of exposure to these things. So like me personally, I've run into this in a lot of the like bigger work I've done with those sort of things, is that like, someone else gets something and I'm like, I pick things up watching other people work. They pick things up. I'm working with me, and like the two of us end up accomplishing more work than, either of us would have individually. So that's kind of how I like to think about it in a lot of instances for these particular.
And I think it is important to go and point out the real value that collaboration can provide in these sorts of situations. As you are essentially collaborating with Matt, I guess some of the things, since we are more of an Illinois focused conversation today because of it being the Headline Club, what are some of the difficulties associated with accessing these data sets, and why does that make it easier to have partnerships and collaboration as you tackle these types of issues?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are some difficulties that are just like inherent in whenever you, as whether you're a journalist or a concerned citizen, you're filing a public records request. These days, quite often, you're asking for data or documents, electronic documents, and so what you're ultimately like running into is a situation where you, as a journalist or someone, are trying to convince a government worker, to convince the lawyers, to talk to the IT people, to get you what you want. And there's so many layers of translation that things go through. You really just kind of have to have some patience for starters, and a good understanding of what you're really looking for. You kind of have to wear all the different hats and think like, well, if I design this system, like how would I store the data? And that, coupled with like a good understanding of the law and some patience, will get you pretty far. As far as collaboration goes, I mean, that first part, like what I call the hunting and gathering of the data, like that's what I like to do. I like to go out and find stuff and bring it back to the to the crew, whoever's going to report the story and take it all the way. I'm there to kind of help and contextualize, fact check, help with any of the analysis and bulletproofing, whatever I can do. But to me, the really thrilling part is like the hunt for the data and like getting it, writing up a little bullet point, synopsis of it. So that in and of itself, as we'll discuss, is quite a lot, I feel like. And so collaborations can help alleviate the pressure of, okay, I just went through all this effort to get the thing. There's somebody who's backing me up who's going to report this out.
And in terms of backing up folks, I will throw this question to Michael. Because of the use of Document Cloud and Muck Rock, you have gotten to see a lot of the behind the scenes issues related to managing large sets of data. Are there any big glaring ones that stand out to you that would be important to raise at the beginning of this conversation?
I'll start on an optimistic note because I feel like so much is challenging with public records and free information. But I think one of the things that stands out to me is that the first time is always the hardest. And so if you can find ways to kind of repeat these projects, if you can find ways to kind of develop solutions to kind of do this in an ongoing way, and I think I think Better Government Association has done so many great examples of this, of kind of like continuing these projects year after year. It does get easier, and I think the first FOIA request you file is the one that's probably the hardest and most intimidating, and the first time you do a major project is going to be the most challenging it gets. And I think so many newsrooms, they'll do a huge project and then they'll move on to the next thing, and I think it's like continuing to sustain that energy. It gets easier and you get a better perspective on that issue over time.
So in terms of going out and repeating projects, sometimes it may come down to carrying out projects over an extended period of time. Looking at a couple of examples here that I've, between gathering them from y'all and seeking them out. Jared, I want to go back to you related to how you would, how would you go ahead and frame a good example of a project where you've been able to go ahead and build on that, as Michael was saying, sometimes repeating the request and thereby streamlining and making it easier to go and tackle.
The biggest one I think that we do, and probably that we're most known for, is the Illinois Public Salaries database, which kind of also hits at a nice little dovetail with the collaboration effort, because it's sort of the beginning of it's built on a lovely program written by Mr. Kiefer related to kind of mass Foias. Everybody gets those terrible emails from people spamming them up, and they're like, how do these get in your mailbox? So he's sort of developed the system where you're using your Gmail to send these requests to government agencies all across the state every year and updating the database every year with new salary records. And it's something that really it's an interesting process, because it starts off, I kind of inherited a thing that somebody else was working on, and we kept working to make it better and sort of changed a few things with, like, it's more useful to see what people are paid at the end of the year rather than budgeted pay. It gives you a more complete picture of how tax dollars are being spent in that thing. And the more that we do this, the more you kind of build in a lot of structure to kind of process this stuff. So you bring it in and you're like, I've now kind of polished up the FOIA request itself. So I've gotten to the point where, like, early on in the process, I would write it and I would get 200 phone calls from people like, what do you mean by total compensation? Or what do you mean by this? And what else? And like, now I've got it to the point where I've got the words non-commercial FOIA request in the subject line. I've got it to the point where I've like defined what I mean by a year, whether it's a calendar year or a fiscal year. And so, like, the number of questions I get now on these are so low. I mean, you get new people in these jobs all the time. There's turnover in government agencies, but like, these come. And then we've also worked out sort of scripts and processing abilities with, like, how do we turn these disparate data sets into a uniform thing to kind of put it online and make the data accessible to everyone else. And like, the more we do this, like, it's not like it becomes easier, or it's not like it becomes easy, but it does become easier kind of as process goes on. So that's been a really good example for us, kind of how working over time has allowed us to sort of get this whole process streamlined and a lot easier, making this sort of information. And it's like, I think it works both for us from a processing standpoint, and it works for other people, because there are some of these places where people go, have you ever filed a FOIA request in Harvey, Illinois? Like, people are like, oh my God, you can never get a response from those people. And it's like, I do get a response for them. So this is part of the, like, making it easier for everyone else, which is, kind of works very nicely and kind of tie up with like Muckrock as well, kind of a document cloud, kind of, you get something in and it makes it available for everyone else. So it's sort of kind of a similar theme that goes throughout, I think, everybody's work here.
I feel like Michael should follow up on that and go a bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great example, and I think there's so many lessons to take from that project. Because I think, coming up with a carefully scoped request and making sure that you're asking for information and explaining for it in a way that the agencies understand is half the battle. I think one thing that journalists and activists and other people are kind of on the outside often make the challenge of is kind of thinking about what are the questions that they have and what are the stories that they want to tell, and sort of framing your request around that. And it's important to keep that in mind. But I think one thing to keep in mind is sort of what data does the agency actually have, and what is the format that they might be able to give it to you, and that's actually going to be useful. I think when starting any project, one thing we recommend is starting small and sort of filing, 5 to 10 sort of test requests to start with, kind of seeing what that initial feedback is, and then refining that. Every time we started a large project and started with 100 or 200 requests, there's definitely things that quickly early on, it's like, oh, we should have used this word, or we should have explained this. And I think thinking through as an iterative process, and then, I think as has previously been said, sort of how do you make this an easy request for the agency to fulfill? Even if that's not what you sort of care most about, sort of think about what's going to come back in a useful format for you, and hopefully not be too painful for the agency.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that and say that's something that we've been noticing in a project that we've been taking on for the past couple of months, which is involving HVAC ventilation system maintenance in schools throughout the country. We started with a small set in North Carolina, and we're able to go ahead and figure out how not to go ahead and burden folks who we were asking the information of, because in most cases they want to help. As much as sometimes you may run into spaces where it's like, no, our job is to obstruct. Some cases are like, do you really want that much information? Can we direct you towards something that's more in line with what you're actually looking for? That's helped us now start to expand that project out and see what other stories may or may not be there across the country, including a few in Illinois that we got some requests for. To that end, Matt, as people look at these projects, I know you have lots of experience with like machine learning efforts and things like that. Is this something that can be helpful, should be helpful? Jared was saying earlier about you go ahead and you figure out how to frame the request so you're running into less of a headache. But is there almost a point where there's too much? I'm asking way too many questions in this and packed into one. But is there a point where you can make it so automated that you're kind of taking away the opportunity to find additional data in what you're asking for?
Yeah, I mean that's the dream, right? To have too much information. I mean that's a good problem to have, I guess, if you end up with that. And yeah, I mean I could only imagine opportunities to apply machine learning. I haven't had a chance to really dabble in that too much. Just basically have used some of the off-the-shelf tools that like Document Cloud could be an example of, like the entity extraction for folks who are unfamiliar. Machine learning can be taught to recognize patterns in text, for natural language processing, for example, like massive PDFs where you need to find people or organizations, that there's tooling that can kind of extract, what would be like the relevant things that you might want to search for. And they do it in a, smart way where it learns that, things, maybe classified differently if you teach it that way. And we're just sort of mainstreaming that type of technology that was more like cutting edge the last 10 years. And now there's more and more tooling that make it accessible. But I think, just on this topic, one thing I think about is that generally when you're talking about detecting patterns and training machines to recognize them, that type of system is really hungry for data. It doesn't do well when you have small sample sizes, and it does much better when you have large sample sizes, particularly if they're kind of like diverse different types and structures and forms. It's going to have a more robust model, to learn from. And so what I think about when it comes to large scale Foia, similar to, Muckrock has, 100,000 requests out, and Jared's, filing 1,000 requests at a time. I think to myself that maybe that's kind of the way to go, is broad Foia. We can talk a lot. I've got a bunch of notes about how to go deep and say, here's one Foia and I want everything under X category. And there's a whole lot to do there in terms of journalism and general open government. But there's also something we said with just these blanket, Foia requests that go out to many different agencies. And I really think that would probably yield some of the best training data for a machine to learn from, because it would be seeing all different ways that you can write up a police report or a building inspection report, or, coronavirus related, records and things that machines can learn from. I think that's a good opportunity to feed the hungry, AI that wants to learn from different examples.
AI does tend to be pretty hungry. I was wondering, well, I was going to ask for all three of you to tackle this question. And also bring up the fact that if you have any questions or anything you want to bring up and kind of see additional conversation points, please feel free to add it into the chat if you are currently in the room live with us. In terms of asking for broad data, how broad is too broad? Because sometimes if it's too, are you saying broad, and what's your scope? Because sometimes you could say you want a lot of data, but data across several states is stored in different in different table headers. That it gets really confusing. So how big is too big, and what can be done? Can anything be done to go ahead and deal with all those minor differences, because there is no like standard?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, and I'm reading also some good questions here in the chat as well. But yeah, I think it depends. The two major categories I would think of, and there's more, but I think about structured data and unstructured, basically PDFs. I used to think structured data was the easier problem to solve because it's structured, and done some things way back earlier with the BGA when we were foiing some of those salary data tables, and had a little like ingestion ETL thing that would inspect the data and kind of figure out a little bit about what it was. And it would just use little simple keyword matching. Like if it has the word name in it, that's probably the name field. And, salary or pay would, so those types of things. I thought, oh, well, you can just do like these rules-based algorithms and parse the data. And it works. It's cool. I actually found, though, that it's probably, and I'm just starting to kind of wrap my brain around like unstructured text analyses and different methods. But I actually think that might be the more solvable problem, is like, what can you say about a document set? Does it have certain keywords in it or certain entities mentioned? And I actually think that because the tooling has come so far around language processing tools, that we might not quite be there yet, but I think that we kind of are. There's like API-based tools, there's point-and-click tools. The closer those things get to like converging, I think we'll start to see a point where you could ask for unstructured PDF reports from many different agencies, maybe every agency in the state, or maybe the top 50 cities in the country. You could ask for reports that some kind of machine learning could say, hey, look over here. It's not going to report the whole story out for you. Like I was talking about, it's good to have a handoff point to somebody to say, hey, make this into a story. And maybe it kind of exists at that handoff point where it's like, hey, you got all the data, and these 10 data sets or documents actually look pretty interesting according to like the way you've defined it.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you run into so many of these, and I've kind of, you've described some of the headaches with some of the salary stuff. You get to a point where you're like, I've seen all of these, like I can just write this script and it will essentially give me everything I need and it'll spit it out. And then, Village fires their financial people, brings a new company in, the whole thing changes up. So it's like you kind of run into these, and you do see patterns and things along them. But yeah, there are definitely kind of hiccups in the system that make it a little trickier. I'm way less experienced in language processing and those end of things, kind of reading for those bits. But there's definitely a huge world out there in terms of running into these things. So it's very interesting.
It is very interesting. And it's something where unstructured data does seem to be the easier, lower hanging fruit, which ties somewhat related into the question that Anthony has in the chat, is have any of y'all tried foiing database schema? I actually heard something yesterday in the panel I was on about something like this, but I was wondering if you've heard any of
I have something in my notes about this one. This is Matt Chapman versus the Chicago Finance Department. Yeah, it's always good to see these, like, this is a requester friendly, as I categorize it, case law that I believe it's at the Illinois Appellate Court level, where the decision just came out this past week or so, basically saying that you can FOIA for metadata. You can ask not just for, hey, can I have some data, but can I get technical documentation that describes the format and structure of the data, which is very powerful for the second step, which is actually asking for the data. Because now you know what exists. You have the roadmap and you can see like where you need to go. I think that that's a great, it's always good to notch one for the requesters, because you can literally cite that one now and say, hey, you got to give this to me. If it wasn't mentioned in the yesterday's session, I'll just point out that I think that there is one exception to this, that folks hopefully don't get their hopes up too high in cases where I believe if a government agency uses like a commercial software to hold their records, that this would probably still be subject to the Illinois Trade Secrets Act. I've run into this before where I've tried to FOIA, not a schema per se, but more or less data in its original format, which would basically divulge the schema. And that was the reason for the no, not that it was too much data, although I think they were trying to make that argument too. But ultimately, the Illinois Attorney General's office sided with the agency. And one of the, I think that was like the only appeal I've ever lost, was because the Cook County Recorder of Deeds made the argument that I could reverse engineer the property record software and go compete with their vendor on that type of thing. So yeah, that was tough luck. But for a government, built database, maybe half of them are in-house and the other half are commercial. You just kind of have to choose wisely when you do that type of approach, because you might end up with a trade secret denial.
Yeah. I haven't done anything since the decision, because it was so recent. I mean, there wasn't a lot of time, but I mean, there's been hundreds of times when I've asked for schemas or data dictionaries, and, you'd often get the response like, what's a data dictionary? I don't even know what that is. Like there's like some oral tradition where they're passing down all the information to each other and they have no idea what I'm talking about. But it's really good to see that decision. I think there is the caveat, if I believe correctly, that there's still the open window for an appeal on that case. So I guess I don't know how applicable it is. Obviously, not a lawyer. Don't take my advice, but that's the one hole in it that could pop up.
Well, it's just kind of funny to read the testimony that was covered in the appellate decision about how, well, if they know what shape the data's in, then we'll just get hacked like the next day. And it's like, sure. Yeah, of course. Like, I mean, that's the case that lawyers are making, but it's just kind of funny. No offense to any lawyers who are in the room, but like, there's like a technical argument to be made, but it's based on sort of like a legal, position. So it's almost like a foregone conclusion. They're going to argue no matter what that this is like a security vulnerability, regardless of how much it actually is. And when you read the kind of technical testimony, it's clear that like it's not really a security concern whatsoever.
Yeah, lawyers and journalists are great at imagining worst case scenarios.
I was reading Michael's comment here. He's still with us in the chat, saying that database schemas is definitely one of the most worrying areas in state laws, but he thinks that legislators and courts are starting to get better at dealing with it. So I think in terms of being able to kind of parse that out, I would add that we are good. Yes, journalists and lawyers are great at figuring this stuff out. How do we make it, in part because of how much data is out there, how do we make it easier for the general public to go ahead and tackle this stuff? Because in many cases, as we all know, most FOIA requests are not filed by journalists or by lawyers. They're filed by the general public. So how do we go ahead and how do we, as we begin to have more and more data, how do we make it easier for them to understand what is or is not possible?
Yeah, that's the tricky part, and you're 100% right. I mean, the Freedom of Information Act is not written for journalists. It literally is written for the public. I mean, this is journalism itself takes place because it's a service of the public. So, I mean, these are, I think, all the things that somebody needs to keep in mind, and it's tricky because you're getting people who, they may be community activists, they may be just interested parties, they may be academics, but there's a lot of people out there who have these skills. I'm not some special kind of, magician who knows how to do these things. There are academics, there are policy people who are have greater abilities than me. And there are people who don't, who just have the interest in it. But I started from somewhere where I wasn't this wasn't my universe of doing all these things and to pick these skills up. And as time goes on, this kind of, I would, suggest to people, there's a good idea to kind of go at to bring these things in. And hopefully at some point you can talk to people or kind of through a more community effort, put things together and be able to kind of to draw more information, kind of find the things out that the government agency or whomever you're kind of focused on aren't able to tell you, immediately. And you kind of these things, and, getting a huge pile of data may seem somewhat intimidating, but, if you keep at it, keep focusing on it, talk to enough people, kind of run into people, find somebody, there are things that you'll kind of run into and be able to achieve with this that you might not otherwise. So don't kind of let the size of it or the universe kind of intimidate you. And hopefully maybe you can get it to the next step, whatever you're trying to work on.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I started out, I learned by doing. So I lost, my share of Foias when I first started doing this. I wrote my first Foia when I was 19. That was denied, and just kind of learning continuously, throughout the process. And the Freedom of Information Act in Illinois was revamped, I guess, around maybe 2008 or 2010 to be more modern, so less focused on paper records and more on electronic stuff. And there's case law around that helps you out. I do have a few quick kind of lightning round little things like statutes and case law that I'll just kind of drop in the chat real quick. But this is my favorite. 146A allows you to specify electronic format. That's critical for everything. I almost always just kind of copy paste that into the requests that I do. A lot of times they'll tell you that it's too much work to pull the data out of their database, but they actually can't do that until they confer with you. It's called unduly burdensome. They have to actually check in with you and see if you'll reduce the request. One thing I'll do is I'll put in an initial request for more than I want. Maybe I want 3 years of data, so I'll ask for 5. That way, when they come back with unduly burdensome, I'll say, okay, I'll take 3 years. And now I'm being flexible. And, if it gets to an appeal, I'm the one who's kind of moving my ground and trying to meet in the middle. So that's always helpful to, there was actually just an opinion about that, PAC opinion 21001. That was Greg Pratt with the Tribune. And he basically indicated that the agency, I believe it was Chicago City Agency, did not confer. And so he won based on that. Another one was, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to jump in because that's the question I was going to ask before you were getting started was actually about, it was actually going to be about specifying an electronic format.
Yeah.
How broad does that go? Does that mean you can request audio files? Does it mean you can request video files? Does it go into where does that lead into?
Yeah, as long as it's feasible. The actual language is you can specify it, and if it's feasible, then they have to give it to you. And one thing that I find that's helpful, we talk about what kind of software your agency uses. If they tell you it's not feasible to get you a spreadsheet and all they can get you is a PDF, you can ask them what kind of software they use. It's good to be, pretty low key about this because this is very strategically important. But you might just want to say offhand, so wait a second, what software do you use? And if they tell you, you can go search out their user manual. And to be honest, a lot of these vendors that market their software to government agencies, they advertise on their website how easy it is to export to Excel. And so you can say, oh, hey, actually, I looked up the user manual for your software, and right here on page 7, it says you go file export. That's how you get it into Excel. And so those are, some of the ways that you kind of have to like do a little bit of reconnaissance and understand like what are they working with, and if it's feasible in Illinois. And by the way, every state has their own, public records law, and the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press has an open government guide. I'm sure I've seen some of this type of documentation on Muckrock as well. And you can, every state's different, but a lot of them are the same. So some of these tips that I share that are Illinois specific, you might just, if you're from outside Illinois, you might just find an equivalent statute.
I was actually looking up. I was getting ready to go share the Muckrock link while you were
yeah.
talking.
I could talk about one other that's kind of a favorite of mine, that talking about agencies that treat a request as burdensome. There's one little rule in Illinois law, this is probably very Illinois specific, that says when an agency blows the deadline, they get either 5 or 10 days. If they blow the deadline to respond to you, they can't treat it as unduly burdensome. It's purely a punitive thing in the FOIA statutes, and I love it. I think of it as like if you watch football, when like the defensive line jumps and they come across the line before the ball is snapped, and the quarterback sees that and he sees the penalty flag and he knows he has a free play because, if it's an interception, it'll get called back. That's what I think of with this one. It's like, oh, I have a free play. I'm going for the end zone because they lost that argument, so I'm going to go for it. Anyway.
And I think that's important to keep in mind, so that way they don't just go ahead and just say, oh, we missed it, sorry. And Jared, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that's why I typically send that FOIA request out, and then I don't call about it not being answered until 5 days and 1 minute after they have not answered it. So I say, hey, did you see this? Because then I'm in the clear.
Let's go ahead. Anthony asked another question: is can you get SQL dumps, which I think is related to the other thing about other statement we were talking before about finding out what type of platform that they go and use. I know I just did that recently with somebody for one of the projects that we're working on right now. They were like, oh, I don't know if we can get this out. And I was like, actually, I just found it right here. You can do it this way. And it made it a lot easier they were like, and they weren't, in that instance, they, again, were like, I don't know how to get it out, but if I can figure it out, I'll get it to you. And the moment I told them, they were like, all right, I'll get it over as soon as I can. And it was great because once you take, in some cases, it's a little bit, it's an either or case. Either they want to be helpful and they don't know how, or they don't want to be helpful. And if there's any way that they can go ahead and find ways to not be helpful, they will do so. And it kind of gets to the idea of changeover in offices and things like that.
Yeah, the figuring the motivation of people is always tricky, but you do have essentially, at least in Illinois code, it clearly defines records in the form in which they're kept. So I mean, if somebody is in fact using a Postgres database, a MySQL database, they should be able to export it in that instance. Now you do run into the issue of FOIA officers who just don't know. I mean, it's like this isn't my universe. Like, I don't know. So they have to go ask somebody else, and somebody else, some data person decides, I don't know if I want to do this. But, you also get like the proprietary data issue, which Matt has talked about a bit. And like, I've talked to a couple of them where they have very old computer systems that they're using, which is not uncommon in the government universe. And sometimes people can do these things, but like Andre pointed out, finding what system they're using exactly is helpful to you, because then you go, you pop yourself over to Stack Overflow, or you pop yourself over to some other website and go, well, this is how you get that. And you kind of get to it. A language I've often used with a lot of these things is tabular delimited format, but there's a lot of other ways to kind of put that kind of language in to get things. And, it depends on, it's going to be a case by case basis, but in theory, it should be possible.
Yeah, I think, to that point, I mean, getting a SQL dump requires knowing that it is a SQL database, and it also requires most likely that it's non-commercial, because a lot of commercial software doesn't offer the ability to do a database dump. So there's two kind of things there that you have to know, that it is a SQL database and it's not commercial software. The amount of work it takes to find that out, because they're not going to tell you. I guarantee you they're not going to tell you, because the person on the phone doesn't know. And also, even if they did know, they don't want to tell you. So the amount of FOIA work you'd have to do to figure that out, you're FOIAing like a training manual, maybe training materials. You've got that fight. And the way I describe it is a round trip. Every FOIA takes, 10 business days. That's 14 calendar days. And so if you want to do some like sleuthing around and nibbling around the edges, go for it. It's just that that's time. And if time matters to you, then you might just think like, well, rather than a SQL dump, I'll just try to get exports of every table and try to figure out what the keys are so I can put them back together. You could ask them to join it up and denormalize it. That's actually, the way the case law, we could talk a little bit about this, but the case law actually is gonna probably nudge you in that direction. Ask the agency to join all the data up together. In my experience, getting normalized data, as Anthony refers to in the question, in the form of a dump, is there's just a few more traps going that way. If you choose your own adventure, that way, there's a few traps.
I mean, that is true, but in some of the notes that you thankfully shared with me earlier in the week, most case law in Illinois does tend to put a high burden on the agency that claims a database.
Yeah,
this can be our burdens. Yeah.
Yeah, this is like my favorite thing in FOIA. It's an appellate court opinion. Someone named Heights sued Waubonsee Community College for just some pretty innocuous data. It's the data he's looking for is not so interesting. It's the fact that he took it all the way to the appellate court, and they basically said, well, if there's an argument to be made that this is in the public interest, that carries a lot of weight. And so that's weighted against the agency's claim that it's unduly burdensome. And in this case, the agency padded, the community college padded the amount of time clearly that it would take to execute a database query. They said it would take like 5 working days to write the query and execute it, which no. But eventually the appellate court just said, well, if it's 5 days, it's 5 days. Clearly there's a public interest has been demonstrated. And so the agency was told to go get the data. And that means a lot, because now the whole argument of like, well, is it too much work? The answer is the agency has a lot of work to do to prove that it is. The requester only has to demonstrate a public interest. Then the agency has to find some overwhelming burden against it. And I'll just say that this replaces, if you ever see, definitely do read Heights versus Waubonsee. It's best bang for your buck for FOIAing data. But if you ever see another case law used to deny you, Shahida versus Madigan, this one's obsolete. This one is from the old paper records days. It was unduly burdensome for people to go black marker redact stacks of paper. And that's where this case law refers to. Nobody's asking for that anymore. So don't take Shahida versus Madigan as a reason for denial. I used to see that, but as soon as Heights versus Waubonsee came out, you use Heights versus Waubonsee. That's the precedent. It's electronic data. It's not paper and marker.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I think a question I have is related to, okay, you have all this data. How do you take a collaborative approach in tackling all this data? Is there a point where it's almost too much data to go ahead and share out, which we already kind of talked about before, saying the importance of collaboration in tackling some of these projects and how sometimes it can lead to better. Well, I'm jumping to the conclusion that it would lead to better reporting, because that's kind of tied to what I premise the existence of my job on. The idea that if you go ahead and can get folks to look at it from different points of view, it will lead to more exposed. But are there, in your experiences, are there things that make that easier or harder to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of kind of tools, and I think it is probably a step-by-step process. There are people who are like in the liberate all data sort of universe that I probably approach it slightly differently, which is like I do like to make a lot of my work and a lot of the process public, but there's also kind of a like first step, second step, whatever else. You have teams. There's a lot of stuff in GitHub that can be done kind of to team collaborate. We're all working from the same sort of universe. SQL works in the same sort of universe with like database servers. Kind of you put something up, everybody has access to it remotely. You're all working in the same universe, and then kind of splitting things up from a team perspective where like, your job is kind of exploring this as Matt has described, and then other reporters kind of chasing things down on the ground. There's a lot of value in kind of running over these things, writing reports on these with things that people discover, counts of basic things, so that instead of having people bugging each other about what do you know about this, how do you know this, kind of being able to look at like what has this person found out, what do they know about it, and what do we still have to discover, kind of approaching these as sort of, I guess, what I would think of as like an academic paper or something like that, when you're like, what has been done before, what have I done now, and what am I going to do in the future to get this accomplished. And like I think a lot of those sort of collaborative tools in the Git universe are very helpful to kind of get some of these things. And I'm sure Matt probably has a number of other opinions as well.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of I think of what's the long-term value of the data when it comes to collaboration. Is this reusable data? And so that kind of raises the stakes a little bit. Like I should go harder for this data because it's going to not just serve the purpose of this story, but future stories. I can share it with other newsrooms. When I was at the Chicago Reporter, we FOIA'd basically just police sworn personnel rosters that dated back to like the mid 20th century. And that's like multiple different systems they had to query. We fought, they lost, they gave up the data. We shared that with the Invisible Institute. And so it just sort of became like, more useful than it was worth the year that, I didn't spend much time on it, just wrote the request, wrote the appeal, and waited 12 months. But it was worth it because this data set was reusable. And that's, I think, is like the great thing about things like Muckrock. I'm always like seeing stuff that it's like, oh, I'm so glad somebody like took the time to post this, because this would have been 2 weeks of my life to wait for this to come back. And here it is. And I also get inspiration from other people's requests. So definitely think about the life cycle of your data beyond what you're going to use it for. And that might make it worth the effort to do more to get it.
And it also, I'll jump in and say, it also leads to people thinking about other ways to connect different sets of data and find additional stories in there. That is something I'm finally getting a chance to kind of sit down and do, is to look and see what has been filed and what's been shared, and then being like, oh, we can totally go ahead and suggest people follow these 2 threads and see what else is out there. And we're hoping to get that stuff started really in the spring, because it is something where it should you should be able to build on stuff rather than have it be a one-off, and then it takes 10 years and you're trying to figure out how do you get back to get that data to go build on. We have another question where we're looking at when you're getting a lot of files and sometimes data sets, do you have tools that you use to manage your own metadata? Like what files mean what things, what different fields and tables mean within those sets of information?
Yeah, I would say for tabular data, I like CSV Kit, which is a command line tool that allows you to inspect and chop up and process CSV, or there's even a conversion utility, so that would include Excel and stuff like that. And that's good because there's ways to do introspection, like what kind of fields do I have in this data and what are some of the most common values. Data set, so I'll just drop that in there, CSV Kit. And then data set is another one that we just had Simon Willison yesterday talk about. It basically will make a SQL database with API endpoints that you can inspect in the browser and you can share it. It's cloud hosted. So those are good just for kind of like, metadata, but also just keeping your data organized. nothing beats a good project management system too. I use Airtable these days to just kind of keep track of what FOIAs are coming and going. And I have notes in there like, what's the bullet list, story pitch that I'm getting out of this, or what questions do I have about it, or who am I going to hand this off to when I get it back? So a lot of it is just sort of staying organized, collaborating, and making sure that there's a way to use the data when you get it back.
Yeah, all those are those are all really good. I don't think there's anything much I use beyond those, and Dataset always blows my mind. Like it's such a cool program. Like it really is.
Yeah, same here. I've been starting to play more with Notion, in part because we use it as a platform at Muckrock, and it has some of the same functionality as Airtable, so it'll actually kind of play and kind of move seamlessly in terms of understanding how to go ahead and manage stuff. I feel like I could ask a wrap-up question right now, but I feel as though there's still one other question in there. But I guess I will ask the wrap-up question right now. Is there something that we have not talked about? I'll do that classic journalist thing. Is there something we have not talked about that you think is important for people to keep in mind when tackling large data sets and using it as reporting as the basis of doing a large reporting project? And since Matt's smirking, I'm going to go. Oh no, Jared looks like he's ready to go first, so I'm going to let him go first.
Boy, I mean, it's always the question you haven't asked or that you haven't done. I mean, you've gotten so much of it, and like it's. I think that a lot of it is like, what is a project? How does somebody approach it? I mean, God, it's so tough. Like, when am I done with this? Like those kind of things. I mean, like these are all like the $1 million questions in these sort of like data projects and data work, and like maybe you don't get everything the first time out. Like the thing I like to keep in mind is like this can be a project that you're working on for a long time. You can kind of approach things as like let's do things as a like step by step process. And I think like you guys have, in particular, have been really good at that kind of universe of like, let's keep approaching these and let's keep coming back to it. I think that's a really good way to approach a lot of this stuff. And like, everything doesn't need to be the one giant, like everything all in project. Like you can kind of approach these as like a step-by-step project, and kind of the more you get, the more you learn, the more you can kind of approach. So there is a little bit of work to be done up front before you're approaching partners working with you and these kind of things. I think all of those are really important to keep in mind when you're working on these things, and kind of think of things as through the project as you're working on them.
Yeah, and the thing that I would add is, it's FOIA Fest, and it directly relates to the Freedom of Information Act and the legal statutes. And it's really good. We've talked this whole time about legal statutes, but just also remember to be thinking like a data person, the person who's actually warehousing this data. You're technically talking to the lawyers and folks when you're writing your request, but you basically want to make sure that your request is also executable from a data standpoint. And so I'll just leave it at, not to be like a downer about it, but there are ways to lose a case. And the most common one, this is like Tribune versus IDFPR if you're interested, but they ask for compiled numbers. I want the total number of this. And they don't have to give that to you. They have to give you the raw data. And as crazy as it sounds, because they'll gaslight you and make you sound crazy, like, yes, I want all 1 million records. I'm not playing around. I don't want to ask for a summary report. Don't ask for the summary report. Because if they're creating a new record for you, maybe they're being generous and they're going to actually create a new record, but that's not guaranteed. They could tell you the next month you will request the same information. You know what? We don't have to create a new record for you. That's not FOIA. And so to be on the right side of the law, you do have to ask for all the information. And we were joking around about how a public information officer will say, oh, you want all 1 million records? Do you have any idea like how heavy that is? How am I supposed to lift that? Of course, yes, 1 million records is no problem. You can make that an email attachment. It's not 1990s anymore with dial-up. So don't let them trick you into thinking that you're being too greedy. It's actually going to be easier for the software engineer at the other end of this, who has to select out the data, to not be too picky and not filter the data down. That's actually harder for them to do from a data perspective. The lawyers might try to convince you that your 100-row spreadsheet is going to be easier to request than the million, but take the million.
Thank you both for those. I'm gonna take moderator's privilege here and throw one more thing out there in terms of keeping in mind, and it's something that came up in the panel I was in yesterday, and it's the idea of harm. Just because you have the data, it comes down to what are you sharing in terms of that data, and how are you making sure that it's understandable in a way for those who you're getting that data for. Because in many cases you have the best of intentions in getting all this data and making sure that this story or this project is presented to the general public, but making sure that they understand what that data means and that you aren't causing more harm as a result of sharing that data. And this can go in many different ways, shapes, and forms. It can lead to a bunch of different it can lead you in many different directions, some of which will not necessarily be what you meant, regardless of the best of intentions. So also not wanting to be a downer, but reminding people that think about the community that you're serving and the community that you're trying to get this information for, and make sure that they can have access to this information. Because one thing we actually did not touch on was on accessibility of understanding how to manipulate that data once you've actually done any reporting. We do have some time left, so if one of you wants to tackle that answer or breeze over that as quickly we can, but it is something to keep in mind. More data does mean it's about flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. It's important to check in early and often before, during, and after the reporting process with someone who can speak for your stakeholders, for your audience. Like, do I get this? Is this intuitive? How about this? Should I try it a different way to present the data in a different way? So always be doing like user-focused design, human-centered design. The second part of that is from a scoping standpoint, always remember that like going out and getting the data is fun, and it's actually pretty time efficient if you're able to get to the point and get your request done. Processing the data is like, it's like the dark matter of the universe. It's actually like 90% of what's out there and you don't see it, but it's like that's the work of taking it from the original to the ultimate like end use of it. That's what kind of you have to keep in mind. It's like, oh, we got all this data, but how do we make a summary that someone can get? Like keep that in mind as you're planning your project, because that's important and you can't skip it.
Jared, you want to add something or?
Here. I mean, I think that covers a lot of it. It's one thing to have the huge information, but making it presentable and making it. I think all that you guys hit it very well.
Well, seeing no more questions, I'm going to thank all three panelists, because I know Michael is out there listening somewhere. But thank you all for participating in this panel. Thank you who were in the audience for taking part and being active. And please feel free to reach out. I think I can speak bluntly and say reach out to any of us if you have any questions or want to follow up or do any of those things. And enjoy the rest of Foia Fest.
Thanks, Andre.
Thanks, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jared.